Okay, joining us now in the After Hours is Daniel Want from Prerequisite Capital. Daniel, when we were kind of chatting in the pregame, you mentioned that you've recently moved, and there was actually some black swans out in your front lawn or in the waterway around you. Is that true?
Yeah, no, definitely. We have.
You weren't just pulling our leg, like you weren't just saying that the black swans, and you said there's two of them. Do two of them negate themselves? Like, is that like a
I don't
negative
know
times
how
a
that works.
negative?
I sometimes I've seen three, but that's the extent of it. But yeah, they tend to. It's quite amusing. I mean, everyone in our industry sort of gets the joke, but especially if they're talking to me, because I'm
Are
usually
are
talking
are
about
black
something to do with banking systems and their vulnerabilities. But
are black swans common in Australia?
yeah, certain parts of
Like, is
Australia,
that your
they.
regular swan? Like,
Um,
because we don't have any. Ours are all white.
yeah, well, at least so I'm on the east coast of Australia, and yeah, the different places I've lived, it tends to be we tend to be black swans around the areas I've been in.
Sort of like the Australian real estate market, no?
That's
Yeah,
right.
well,
Speaking
depends
of
on
black
the way you look
swans,
at it and your time horizons. Yes.
Well, listen. So you're out in Australia. Here we're on the other side of the world, up in Canada. So we always love to hear an update on what's going on in the real estate markets out there. So what's your take? I know you did a research piece. I'm going to just put it up here on Australian property. That's a lot of pages to go through all the way. But the question I have for
one
you is like,
That,
why don't you give us the
that
one
rundown?
second
Are you
before you
bullish or
do this,
bearish?
Patrick. But one second before you say anything, Daniel, I just want to preface this with that I was actually in San Diego and I met an Australian surfer, and I have it on good authority that the market in Australia is ripping again.
yeah. There you
Is
go.
that true? Is my surfer buddy correct?
Well, it's trying to. We're definitely in an environment where positive surprises are you know, it is the season. So yeah, I mean, Melbourne and Sydney property prices are starting to sort of show signs of life again, and our lending aggregates are, arguably bottoming out in terms of the declines they've been in and different things. So there's a lot of, I guess, positive surprises, I guess, is the best way to put it at the moment. I mean, that report you're
But okay,
looking at,
what's your bias though?
sorry.
What's your bias though? Are you do you still see vulnerabilities and risks there, or do you think that this is now properly mean revert and it's probably going to remain stable here?
So it all comes down to the time horizon. So over the next 12 months, at least according to our methodologies and frameworks, it's still likely to be resilient here. And we're not going to at least be at risk of imminent crash. I mean, and then, on a longer time horizon, a multi-year, say 3 years from now, ish, that's when the real window of vulnerability starts to open up here for a meaningful debt default cycle, unemployment, and obviously that pulls the rug from our banks and our property market. We're definitely vulnerable on a multi-year, multi-decade basis, and
So,
definitely overdue for a washout. But there's a lot of dynamics at play here, especially in Australia, that people tend to underappreciate.
now, the Reserve Bank of Australia has been cutting rates for the last little while. The question I have is like, has that translated actually to considerably lower mortgage rates?
Um, Generally, yes, the spreads have been starting to. So both, they've more or less been passed on, and also the spreads have been starting to come in a little bit from the wides that they've been at. But yeah, I mean the interest rates, at least in the study and research I've done, at least here in Australia, it can be a little like in the US, it's slightly different sort of system, but here it's not in terms of material drivers of so interest rates tend to be more coincident to other things that lead, and especially when you start talking about the central bank, all they ever do is just react anyway. They're the sort of last of the
Right.
party, and they trail conditions that are unfolding. Eventually, here in Australia, we'll catch up to the rest of the world with zero interest rate policy. I just don't know whether that's what sort of multi-year time horizon it is before we hit zero. Could be
So,
sooner. Could
so
still be a
Daniel,
while.
is that what's driving? Daniel, sorry to interrupt. It's Kevin here. Is that what's driving the recent uptick that we're seeing? Is the fact that as they've aggressively lowered rates, the consumers responding with buying houses again, or is it more to do with what we would have to assume is a credit impulse coming out of China in reaction to the recent slowdown?
Well, actually, probably one of the biggest and underappreciated dynamics of concerning Australia, both our banking system, but especially our property market, actually has to do with the capital flow sort of way of looking at things. So, for example, our entire banking system, if we were to just simplistically define it as central bank and commercial bank assets, is about 2 trillion-ish US dollars, whereas the banking systems of pretty much the rest of the world that matters is more like 140, 150 trillion dollars. Anytime you get stress in the world, there's a sequencing effect that happens. And by the way, our entire property market here in Australia is capitalized, so land and buildings, the whole lot, is capitalized roughly at about 5 trillion US dollars. And that 5 trillion US dollar market capitalization is actually determined by only about 200 billion US dollars worth of transactions every year, right?
Right.
And so $200 billion US dollars worth of transactions every year determine basically the pricing fortunes or the market capitalization of our property market, which in the scheme of the world is just, we're nothing. We're so small. We're sort of just a ship floating around on a pretty big ocean out there. Now, the dynamic that people underappreciate is whenever there's stress in the world, there's a sequencing dynamic through our currency in particular. Stress in the rest of the world, at T equals 0, so when the stress occurs, tends to have a discounting effect on our Aussie dollar. So our currency falls, and that tends to discount at least a degree of risk in our system and economy. But the dominoes are put in motion, like stress in Europe, stress in Asia especially, but the same holds for pretty much most countries around the world. Stress dominoes into at least part of, the participants in those countries looking for greener pastures to diversify internationally. So you get capital movement, and capital is agitated in the world. And of course, Australia basically being on the other side of the world to, Europe and the Middle East. And so, we're pretty much an island nation in the middle of nowhere, more land than we know what to do with, stable rule of law, perfect weather, or depending where you go. But, we have a lot going for us, and, reliable capital markets and institutions, all the rest of it. So just even a small bit of that capital exiting the rest of the world, especially Asia and Europe, coming into Australia, because by the time months later that the capital is actually really moving and the stress dominoes have played out, they look at Australia and go, oh, and they've got a slightly cheaper currency too. Let's go in there. And so that then backstops our banking system and our funding requirements, so our credit engine in this system. And then it naturally also finds its way into our property markets. And so on a domestic basis, our property markets and real estate is very much like a confidence asset, like we were talking about before, because of all of the credit that underpins it, and we're over leveraged and all the rest of it. But on an internationalized basis, Australian property is really more akin to a safety asset, right?
Yeah.
And so you can track
it's interesting,
those capital flows and those stress events, and that actually leads our property price growth by 12 months on average. And that's one of the biggest drivers.
What's interesting is that I've heard the same type of an argument a couple of years ago from this Kevin Muir guy about Canadian real estate. Kev, do you recall that conversation?
That's right. I said that we're going to be a lot different than the Americans because
because
it's basically an outlet valve for when we run into problems that we can let the currency go.
Exactly. So the current what happens is that we have the benefit that a lot of it translates through the currency move rather than the nominal prices of things like real estate. Where like I think what exacerbated the U.S. real estate problem was that the U.S. dollar was skyrocketing at the same time as the real estate and the economy was tanking, right? And that actually made things worse. Is that a fair way of kind of summing that up?
Yeah, I mean, like when you're starting to talk about the US system and where it places in the broader global system, this, it's slightly different setup, but especially for
Hmm.
Australia here, it's definitely the case. I mean, our currency is a very valuable shock absorber for a lot of things.
Absolutely. So let's move on to those Australian banks because I know like a year or two ago that one of the most popular things that I kept hearing was everyone like which one of these Aussie banks to short, and that was like something that the way a lot of people wanted to express their bearishness on the Australian real estate market was by going short many of these Aussie banks. What's your take on what the banking system looks like, and what are you noticing here when it comes to Australian banks?
Yeah, I mean, so on a longer term basis, our banks are, you know, they have problems. They're a little bit unbalanced and all the rest of it, and overexposed. And even here in Australia, it's like leverage on leverage on leverage is, like both at a household level, at a banking system level, and then even for the last decade or more, it's like our entire economy has kind of been on the back of that leverage cycle in China as well, and so,
Right.
that's it's not a very, encouraging set of foundations there. But so our banking system, but on a shorter term basis, like when about 18 months ago, when we really started to get serious, mostly because we were um, contracted by a group here to do deeper dives into our banks and things. Um, we all of the usual leading indicators and leading relationships to debt default cycles in Australia, um, they just were not showing any signs of a debt default cycle anytime soon. In fact, it's just been surprisingly resilient, and still is. And even on all of those leading indicators that have useful, historic experience, to the degree that they still matter, which I'd imagine they probably will. We're still at the earliest, probably 12 to 18 months away from any meaningful transition into a meaningful debt default environment here in Australia. And so, and then we had a bit of a funding squeeze at a wholesale level with our banks over the last 18 months. But even that, because of this capital flow dynamic. So we hit basically a lull in capital flows about 18 months ago, actually about
Right.
24 months ago. And that really was what snowballed into, and then we compounded it with a banking royal commission. And it's you're never going to find good things when you put a magnifying glass over our banks. And so that sort of snowballed, and pessimism got out of control and all the rest of it. But literally, at least according to our models, that capital flow dynamic starts to reverse literally this back half of this year, from literally July onwards. And so we were, loosely, according to those sorts of models, knowing that we didn't really have heightened probability of risk around a debt default cycle kicking off anytime soon. And we knew we were going to have tailwinds coming back in on a capital flow basis, sometime the back half of this year-ish, which then eased off our wholesale funding market tightness and all the rest of it. And now we've got the preconditions. We're actually starting to see those, positive surprises or green shoots that are appearing. It's probably going to just be markets doing what they always do, which is setting up the most people to be hurt. Because what will happen
Right.
now,
Right.
if we get more, if these positive surprises tend to snowball, we get a bit of price growth even in, some of the major parts of Australian property, and, lending aggregates are starting to kick back in potentially. 12, 18 months from now, everyone will be, back into it. It's always dangerous talking about property here in Australia because it really is our national religion. And
Welcome.
Same with us here in Canada. We're the similar. Daniel, do you think that the Australian dollar's found the bottom at 67 cents for the time being?
Look, possibly on a shorter term basis, yes. But on a, as the time horizon extends out to, say, a year, 2 years, 3 years, then I'd be pretty surprised if we've seen the bottom. I think it'll go much lower.
Why? Because you just think ultimately the excesses in the real estate market and all of this has to be unwound?
Yeah, well,
Because
we
you
have
said
quite
you
a few
mentioned earlier
different...
that you're actually sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. You said earlier that you're a little bit of a dollar bear longer term, U.S. dollar bear longer term. So that also kind of makes me wonder if you're an Australian dollar bull kind of longer term.
Yeah, and when we say longer term, I'm guessing probably, 4 or 5 years plus time horizons, right? As dollar bear, US dollar bear, possibly.
Okay.
Basically, eventually the Fed and the US government will overreact and, to some form of issues. They'll probably turn banking system issues into a currency issue past a point. And that point, I'm guessing, could be in that 4 to 5 year horizon. Could be sooner, could be later. I don't know. Just see what happens. But past a point, they will do things that will really harm their currency, and everywhere else will have already been washed out anyway in most of the currencies around the rest of the world, including the Australian dollar. So on, say, over the next 3-ish years for the Australian dollar, I still think the path of least resistance is lower. But on the other side of a bit of a meaningful washout or a debt default cycle here in Australia, I think people will probably be surprised at how we come back, and even the Aussie dollar potentially could go on quite a run on a 10-year time horizon from now, because we just have a lot of stuff going for us. And once we've had that washout relative to, the different dynamics that are unfolding in the rest of the world, like in Europe and Japan and even China, Australia's going to be looking pretty good, especially because a lot of the world views even the Australian dollar, as effectively a hard-backed currency because of our resources and things. And if we've washed out our banking system and the excess in the property markets and things, and we've rebalanced a little bit, then, we've got a lot of stuff going for us on a 10, 15, 20-year basis.
Hey, what? 1 second, Patrick. I want to interrupt. One last question. I'm going to put Daniel on the spot here. So you guys have I think you've gone 25 years without a recession? It's like some crazy number, right,
26,
Daniel?
27. It's starting to get ridiculous.
Yeah.
Well, it's already been ridiculous.
It's absolutely nuts.
But
yeah.
The reason
so do you think you manage the next do you think they manage the next slowdown again, managing to skate without a recession? Or do you think you'll finally get the official recession that has eluded Australia for so long?
Oh, yeah, no. In the sort of debt default cycle that I'm talking about that seems to be on the, horizon on a multi-year basis, that's definitely going to be classified as a recession here.
Okay, so you think within the next 3 years,
yeah,
right, within the next 3 years, we get a recession in Australia that ends the streak. So we don't make it to 30.
We might get to 30, but in the next 3 to 5 years, I'd be pretty surprised if we haven't had quite a cold shower.
Right.
So, yeah, no, that's it's so interesting to kind of see. Like, you have obviously this view that this is going to be still a couple years out, but I mean, what risks are there that this, for instance, I personally think that the Canadian and Australian dollars are poised to do incredibly well once the next commodity bull market begins.
Oh, yeah.
But the question of when the next commodity bull market is going to begin is exactly like one of your longer term time horizon scenarios. I mean, we could be years away from a narrative like that. I mean, what is the most immediate risks to your scenario accelerating? Like, you keep talking about this kind of an 18-month plus scenario, but what could go wrong in your mind that would accelerate this to a 2020 story?
You got to understand, we've just been through such a bout of pessimism in our general conditions here, and especially the property and banking story. Like our Royal Commission and then just everything else that unfolded has been pretty intense. And the way the banking system has sort of had to find a new footing, and they've, for the last 2 years even, have been really overhauling the way they've, lending standards and terms and all of this sort of stuff. Like they've really had to reshift things. So we've actually, like, that pessimism relative to the actual underlying resiliency of our system, at least for the last couple of years, it really overshot the reality of conditions. We're kind
Right.
of bouncing back a little bit. And even though we're in an environment of, say, positive surprises for the next 12-ish months or 18 or whatever, or at least to the degree that our frameworks and models and leading indicators and things, stay intact. It's still going to be somewhat sluggish. I don't think exactly we're going to be roaring ahead anywhere. And this is what I was getting at in terms of, like, setting up markets doing their thing to set up the most people to get hurt. Because 18 months, 24 months from now, if property markets and our conditions start to materially roll over again, I can guarantee you're going to have the majority of participants here in Australia, especially around property and whatever, going, oh, wow, they'll start to see the deterioration in conditions, or even in weakness starting to come into prices again. And they'll go, oh, I'm not going to get suckered out like I did 2 years ago, and they'll ignore that deterioration, because a lot of people have really been shaken in this last 2 years. And they'll go, oh,
Right.
in fact, they probably will actually buy into those initial elements of weakening. The problem is that there's, the trap doors are open, and it's just going to keep deteriorating, and eventually they will get trapped. One of the things we did not have in the last 2 years is, even though we've had all of this pessimism, we really didn't enter into any conditions of forced selling of property or anything else. And so, but we will well and truly see forced selling on any swing down, 2 years from, or 3 years from now, if it happens. Because people are just going to be set up brilliantly by the sadistic market that we have, just for hammering.
So what I want to ask you about is interest rates and the idea of negative interest rates in Australia, because we in Canada we also have not seen negative interest rates, or even interest rates really sustain at zero for any extended period of time. But we've had polos here in Canada, at least in different meetings, talk about negative interest rates, said that if things get bad enough, it's a possibility that they would go there. I mean, in Australia, is there a possibility if the situation deteriorates that they'd go negative there?
I'm not sure. I mean, they're already talking about QE, which is, look, at the end of the day, Australia is really just going to follow the rest of the world central banking precedent anyway. I don't
Right.
think we're really going to buck the trend in all of that. I don't know. I know the legalities in the US become a bit problematic when it comes to the idea of a negative interest rate by the Fed. But see, and on a market-driven basis, who knows? Like, the biggest problem in the world is
Yeah.
that on a multi-decade basis, we've been sustaining underproductive capacity and resource allocation out there. And so the actual productive output is becoming less and less useful, right? And every time that big overhang of underproductive capacity out there starts to shake or wobble in the direction of, say, a debt default or an asset impairment cycle or an unemployment sort of cycle, then authorities everywhere in the world just panic and throw the kitchen sink at it. And all that's done is
You
sustain
know,
it. And, it past a point that becomes uncontrollable. You might be able to control nominal yields through policy measures, but ultimately they can't control real yields. And that's where I suspect there'll be sort of Mr. Market, or at least those primary economic dynamics will come back and bite that
you
system.
you know you know what I think both the Canadian and Australian markets need? they need to follow the lead of the Danish and have negative mortgage rates. Now that would be something that all Canadians and Australians need, right?
Yeah.
That's speaking from somebody that's long house in the cottage there.
Yeah, well,
Don't
that,
talk up his book. Nothing's
Uh, yeah, but I mean, isn't that crazy that there? Like, I actually was a seller on this idea. I said, look, okay, yeah, central banks might put negative overnight lending rates, but there's no way they would ever pass that on to a consumer. And here we have in Copenhagen or whatever, like the Danish are like outright offering negative, like half a percentage point mortgage rates in Europe. Like, what the WTF was that?
Yeah.
Like, that's I never thought in my life that I would see. Like, I don't even know how does that even work? You borrow a mortgage and then
And you
you
pay
don't
back
pay
less.
you don't pay make any payments, and
No,
then
no, no. You make payments because it's still amortized.
it's still
But as you,
amortized.
but you're still, the payments you're making is on a principle that's getting reduced by the rate instead of getting increased by the rate.
Jesus Christ! Like, what? That's insanity. But, like, you know what? Like,
Oh, but Patrick, it's the solution to everything. Just do more and more monetarism.
yeah, it
Anyways,
is.
we don't need to get in the poor Daniel doesn't need to get in a fight with us. You hear us fight about
Well,
stuff.
but that's-
I know, Patrick, you had one chart you wanted to talk to Daniel
Yeah.
about. Why don't you pull that chart up and let's get to the copper versus what is
yeah.
it, gold?
Yeah, this is I'm glad you put this into your chart book, Daniel, because you know what? Actually, it wasn't Jeffrey Gunlack who recently also talked about the correlation of the gold copper ratio versus the yield, but it is a really interesting ratio because I've always looked at it as that's the economy, like Dr. Copper against a safe haven asset such as gold, and using that as an indicator. So, what are you sharing with us here on this chart?
yeah, no, that chart was really just about illustrating the fact that this last 8 months or whatever has really just been it's just a collateral bid. And so, the gold copper ratio is a classic way to illustrate gold's function as collateral. It's pretty reliable throughout history.
Yeah.
And so when you strip out, say, copper, which is, symbolically representative of the broader, economic growth and conditions or whatever, then you're left with that, currency demand or collateral demand component of gold. I mean, it's a bit simplistic, but it illustrates the point. And then obviously with that euro-dollar flow lead, it just basically indicates when things tighten out there in the world, and especially in the banking system, and that broader financial system becomes more risk averse and tightens, then naturally that sets dominoes into motion towards a greater demand for collateral. And we've seen
Right.
that most definitely. And this is the thing, it's like, because we've seen this run up in gold with inflation expectations falling, with, obviously the real yield has fallen. And so that's, this is that's a step down in sort of growth pricing and expectations more than anything. And then that, in the world we're in and the system we're in, that, any materially lower growth expectation starts to give rise to, a lot of people looking around going, oh, wow, there's a lot of vulnerabilities in this system. Let's just edge closer towards owning some more collateral. And so we've had a bit of a scramble for collateral, this last 8 months. And, it's probably a little bit overdone short term, obviously, but those underlying dynamics unfortunately tend to self-reinforce, especially when you're talking about the massive sort of global banking system and the Eurodollar type system. When they start in aggregate or collectively start to tighten up their balance sheets and sort of inch towards the exits, then that has a self-fulfilling dynamic to it. And so that tightens
Right.
conditions, and then, that becomes reflexive. And so paying attention to what that broader community of actors are doing is pretty huge. And so I still think, collateral over the next 2 years-ish is going to be very well valued, and there's some increasing chances that there are going to be some scrambles for that collateral. Now, I'm still biased towards treasuries as opposed to precious metals if you're going to skew a collateral holding. But that's probably another can of worms.
So, Daniel, I know that I know you're a little bit of a longer term prognosticator, but I'm going to kind of put your feet to the fire and see if I can get a little bit of a shorter term trade out of you. If you had to pick something for the next 3 months for people to have a look at, an idea that the market is either too confident of or is too pessimistic on, what's your favorite thing? Like, we'll make this the last question of the night or of the morning for you, as it is Australia. It is morning in your neck of the woods. But do you mind kind of giving us on a shorter term perspective something that you think people should have a look at?
Yeah, well, so the options pricing, especially in the calls over gold, on a less than 2 or 3 month time horizon, they've really got out of hand. At least by the way we measure and model and map things. And so I'd imagine that's going to come in a bit, some form of a, like, I wouldn't necessarily recommend anyone short calls on gold, out of the money short calls or something. But yeah, we tend to, so we've just got these liquidity signals both on gold and on, we got 10-year a few weeks
ago. So
you'd
be a covered call writer here. So you would go.
No, it's the other way. No, Pat.
I'd be selling
Patrick, Daniel's saying that the demand for calls is through the roof.
Right, which is like selling call premium against your gold position.
Yeah, but I think he's saying that I don't want to put words in your mouth, Daniel, but I believe he's saying that gold's overextended and that gold is due for a pullback. Are you not?
Yeah, I'd rather look at a pullback in gold than a pullback in treasuries if I had to short-term trade it.
There you go.
But
I hear you. That's actually a great call.
I'm not.
I hear you. It's scary either way.
Right. So.
Yeah, I understand. We won't hold you to that. You should see the stuff that Patrick says all the time. Don't worry. You won't embarrass yourself any more than Patrick does. Anyways, why don't you tell people again where they can find you, Daniel?
Yeah, so prerequisite.com.au is probably best. And then every so often on Twitter, Daniel J. Want.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. It's a pleasure meeting you, and be careful of those black swans. I hope it's not an ominous development that you brought it to our attention.
Oh, mate, they're awesome to watch, actually. They're very peaceful and placid, and, very graceful.
Yeah, okay.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Daniel.
Thanks again, Daniel.
See you guys. Bye.